Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in American history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the winter of 1943, as war raged across Europe, a quiet tragedy was unfolding behind the fences of Camp Metobrook, a prisoner of war facility nestled in the dense forests of northern Michigan. Official records stated that 40 German prisoners arrived that December. By spring, 31 men had been reduced to shells of their former selves, distant eyes, incoherent speech, and behaviors so disturbing that military physicians created an entirely new classification for their condition. Only 9 emerged with their minds intact. The official explanation blamed harsh winter conditions and isolation, but weather doesn't fracture a man's psyche so completely that he can no longer recognize his own reflection. This is the true account of what happened at Camp Metobrook, a story the government buried for decades until a chance discovery in 1968 finally revealed the macabre secret that lay behind those fences. It began with a simple transfer order. The prisoners captured in North Africa were being moved from an overcrowded facility in Texas to the newly constructed Camp Metobrook. The camp sat on the edge of the Hiawatha National Forest, surrounded by miles of pine trees and isolated from the nearest town of Whitefish by 15 miles of unpaved road. Built to house up to 100 prisoners, the camp consisted of 4 barracks, a mess hall, infirmary, administrative building, and guard quarters, all encircled by 2 layers of chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Watchtowers stood at each corner, though records indicate they were often understaffed due to personnel shortages. According to transport manifests, the prisoners arrived on December 12, 1943. Temperature records from nearby Sault Ste. Marie show it was minus 15 degrees that day, with snow already 2 feet deep in the forest. The commanding officer, Major William Hargrove, noted in his log that the prisoners seemed in good spirits despite the cold, and were grateful for the hot meal provided upon arrival. This would be the last positive entry in Hargrove's log. 3 days later, he wrote, "Prisoner Heinrich Volker found staring at the perimeter fence for 4 hours. When approached by guards, he claimed someone was watching from the trees. Forest inspection revealed no tracks or evidence of intruders." By December 20th, similar incidents had been reported involving 5 more prisoners. Major Hargrove requested additional perimeter patrols, believing the men might be planning an escape. Nothing was found. No footprints in the snow, no disturbances in the fence. Just the endless white of winter and the dark silhouettes of pine trees standing like sentinels around the camp. The first real indication that something was wrong came on Christmas Eve. The camp's physician, Dr. Thomas Lawson, documented a disturbing increase in insomnia among the prisoners. Over half reported hearing voices or whispering coming from the woods at night. Dr. Lawson initially diagnosed it as a mass stress reaction, not uncommon among prisoners of war. He prescribed mild sedatives and recommended additional blankets to guard against the cold. But it wasn't the cold that was getting to them. On December 26th, prisoner Werner Müller was found unconscious in the shower facility. His fingernails were broken and bloody from apparently clawing at the tile walls. When he regained consciousness, he spoke incessantly about the visitors who came into the barracks at night. According to Dr. Lawson's notes, Müller insisted these entities were slipping through the walls and standing over the beds. 3 other prisoners corroborated Müller's account, though they refused to provide details, reportedly fearing that speaking of them makes them stronger. By New Year's Day, 1944, the situation had deteriorated significantly. 17 prisoners were now exhibiting symptoms of extreme paranoia. They refused to sleep in their bunks, instead huddling together in the center of the barracks. They took turns watching the walls. Some had started carving small symbols into their beds, protective sigils, according to the camp's translator. Major Hargrove, growing increasingly concerned, requested a psychiatric specialist be sent from the military hospital in Detroit. His request was denied due to wartime personnel limitations. On January 3rd, the first tragic incident occurred. Anton Weiss was found deceased in the washroom. No note was left. His bunkmates reported that Weiss had stopped speaking 2 days earlier after claiming to have seen someone wearing his face standing outside the barracks window. The official report attributed his passing to combat stress and depression. 3 more prisoners experienced serious incidents in the following week. 2 did not survive. Major Hargrove implemented 24-hour monitoring and removed all potentially dangerous materials from the barracks. In his January 10th report to his superiors, he wrote, "Something is happening in this camp that defies explanation. The men are terrified of the barracks at night. They speak of visitors or watchers. Some now refuse to look in mirrors or reflective surfaces. Request immediate transfer of all prisoners to another facility." His request was denied. A peculiar note appears in Dr. Lawson's medical log from January 15th. He had begun interviewing the 9 prisoners who showed no signs of the spreading psychological disturbance. All 9, he noted, had something in common. They had chosen bunks along the southern wall of the barracks. The affected prisoners were primarily those who slept along the northern wall, the side facing the deepest part of the forest. When Dr. Lawson attempted to relocate some affected prisoners to the southern bunks, they became hysterical, claiming they are already waiting there. By the end of January, conditions had become untenable. 25 prisoners were now showing severe psychological symptoms. They spoke of the visitors who came from the trees. They carved symbols into their skin. Some stopped speaking altogether. Others wouldn't stop screaming. Dr. Lawson, overwhelmed by the situation, began administering heavy doses of sedatives just to maintain order. The camp's records reveal a disturbing pattern that developed during this period. Guards reported that the affected prisoners would often be found standing motionless, facing the northern wall of their barracks for hours at a time. When questioned, they either could not or would not explain their behavior. Several guards noted in their reports that the prisoners seemed to be listening to something that no one else could hear. One guard, Sergeant Frank Pearson, wrote in his personal journal, later discovered among his possessions after his passing, in 1962, that he had begun to experience similar phenomena. "I've started hearing it too," he wrote on January 22nd. "A faint whispering that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It's most noticeable during the night shift, especially between 2 and 4 a.m. The words are indistinct, but the tone feels inviting, like someone calling you to come closer. I've caught myself walking toward the forest edge several times without consciously deciding to do so." Sergeant Pearson requested a transfer on January 25th. His request was granted, and he left Camp Metobrook on January 28th. His journal entries after leaving the camp indicate he continued to experience auditory hallucinations and insomnia for several months, though these symptoms eventually subsided. He never returned to northern Michigan. On February 6th, during a particularly severe blizzard, the camp lost power. In the 18 hours it took to restore electricity, 4 more prisoners were lost to tragic circumstances, and 6 others suffered what Dr. Lawson termed complete psychological breaks from reality. When the lights finally came back on, guards found messages scratched into walls, floors, and even the skin of the affected prisoners. According to the translator's notes, they all conveyed variations of the same message. They come through the walls when darkness falls. One of the most disturbing accounts from this period comes from Private George Collins, who was stationed at one of the guard towers during the blackout. Due to the blizzard conditions, visibility was near zero. and the guards had been instructed to maintain their posts, but to focus primarily on keeping warm until conditions improved. In his report, filed on February 3rd, Collins described hearing movement in the compound below, despite the howling wind and driving snow. "I shined my flashlight down," he wrote, "but the beam couldn't penetrate more than a few feet in the blizzard." The movement continued. It sounded like multiple individuals walking through the snow, but with an odd, shuffling gait. I called out the standard challenge, but received no response. I fired a warning shot, and the movement stopped momentarily, then continued, now moving away from the tower and toward the barracks. I radioed for backup, but due to the storm, no additional personnel could be deployed. When I described what I was hearing, the officer on duty suggested it was likely just the wind or falling snow from the trees. But I know the difference between natural sounds and footsteps. Something was moving out there in the dark. Many somethings. Private Collins requested a transfer the following day. Unlike Sergeant Pearson, his request was denied. He remained at Camp Metobrook until its evacuation on February 11th. After his discharge from the military in 1946, Collins suffered from severe PTSD and alcoholism. He passed away in 1957 at the age of 36, reportedly from liver failure. Military authorities finally responded to the crisis. On February 10th, a team led by Colonel James Barrett arrived to evaluate the situation. Barrett's report, classified until 1968, described the scene as more reminiscent of a psychiatric ward than a prisoner of war camp. Of the original 40 prisoners, 13 were deceased, 10 from tragic circumstances, 3 from self-inflicted incidents, and 18 others were in states of catatonia or extreme psychological distress. Only 9 prisoners remained lucid and coherent. Colonel Barrett's team included Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a psychiatrist specializing in combat trauma. Her assessment of the affected prisoners, included as an appendix to Barrett's report, provides a clinical perspective on their condition. The symptoms displayed by these men go far beyond anything I have previously encountered in cases of war neurosis or combat fatigue, she wrote. They exhibit a unique constellation of symptoms that include profound dissociative states, persistent visual and auditory hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and what can only be described as a form of identity disturbance. Most disturbing is their consistent report of entities they variously describe as visitors, watchers, like or not quite human, that they claim can move through solid objects and take on the appearance of familiar individuals. Dr. Warren interviewed each of the 9 unaffected prisoners separately. In her notes, she expressed puzzlement at their apparent immunity to what she tentatively diagnosed as a contagious psychotic disorder. These men acknowledge awareness of the phenomena described by their affected comrades, she wrote, but claim to have found ways to protect themselves. When pressed for details, they become evasive. One prisoner told me, "It is better you do not know. Knowledge attracts their attention." Another said, "If I tell you how to fight them, you will begin to see them. And once they know you can see them, they never stop watching." Colonel Barrett immediately ordered the evacuation of all prisoners to a military hospital in Detroit. The 9 unaffected men were later transferred to a POW camp in Pennsylvania, where they reportedly served out the remainder of the war without incident. The 18 affected prisoners were held in psychiatric care. According to fragmentary records, none ever recovered. They were eventually transferred to various mental institutions after the war, their conditions listed as permanent and untreatable psychological disorder of unknown origin. What the official reports don't mention is that several members of Barrett's team began experiencing symptoms similar to those of the prisoners within days of arriving at Camp Metobrook. According to Dr. Warren's private correspondence, later discovered among her papers after her passing in 1978, 2 military policemen who had assisted in the evacuation reported hearing whispering, voices, and experiencing vivid nightmares, in which they were watched by figures standing motionless at the foot of their beds. Both men were placed on medical leave and eventually discharged from service with psychiatric diagnoses. Dr. Warren herself noted changes in her sleep patterns and mental state after leaving Camp Metobrook. "I find myself avoiding mirrors," she wrote in a letter to a colleague dated March 1944. "I know this is irrational, yet I cannot shake the fear that what I might see looking back at me would not be my own reflection. More disturbing are the periods, brief but increasing in frequency, when I feel as if I am observing my own actions from a distance, as if someone else is controlling my body while I watch. I have told no one of these experiences for fear of being relieved of my duties, but I confess I am afraid of what may be happening to my mind." Dr. Warren continued her psychiatric practice after the war, but specialized in less traumatic cases, focusing primarily on adjustment disorders and mild depression. She never published any findings related to Camp Metobrook and reportedly refused to discuss the case even with close colleagues. Her personal papers, including her correspondence about the camp, were only discovered after her passing when her daughter was sorting through her belongings. Camp Metobrook was abandoned after the evacuation. Military police cordoned off the area, and all personnel who had served there were reassigned to distant posts. The official explanation given to inquiries from the Red Cross and other organizations was that the camp had been closed due to unsuitable conditions and extreme weather. The truth remained buried in classified files until 1968, when a government clerk named Richard Dennison discovered the Barrett Report while archiving old military documents. But the Barrett Report wasn't the only document Dennison found. Hidden among the official military records was a personal journal belonging to Dr. Thomas Lawson. What Lawson documented in those pages reveals a horror far beyond what the official report suggested. A horror that may explain why the military was so quick to abandon Camp Metobrook and bury its history. According to Lawson's journal, the problems at Camp Metobrook began before the German prisoners ever arrived. During construction in the summer of 1943, workers reported unusual occurrences, tools disappearing only to reappear in different locations, strange sounds coming from the forest, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. Several workers refused to stay on the site after dark. The project foreman dismissed these accounts as nerves and superstition. But he did note in his reports that the construction fell behind schedule due to an unusual rate of worker turnover and unexplained accidents. More disturbing were Lawson's notes about the land itself. He had apparently spoken with a local man from Whitefish who claimed the area where the camp was built had been considered unwelcoming by the native Ojibwe people. They called it the place of hollow voices and avoided it entirely. According to local legend, several logging operations in the late 1800s had been abandoned after workers began experiencing visions and unusual behavior. The man told Lawson that the last attempt to develop the area had been in 1912, when a hunting lodge was built near the same site. All 5 members of the hunting party that stayed there were found deceased or missing, with the sole survivor discovered wandering the forest, incoherent and distressed. The survivor reportedly spoke of people who weren't people coming out of the trees at night. Lawson's journal contains a transcript of an interview he conducted with this survivor, identified only as Mr. R, at a sanitarium in Marquette. The interview, dated November 15, 1943, nearly a month before the prisoners arrived, suggests Lawson had concerns about the camp location before operations even began. Mr. R had been institutionalized since the 1912 incident, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He was 68 years old at the time of the interview and had not spoken coherently about the incident in decades, according to the sanitarium staff. Lawson noted that the man became agitated when he mentioned the location of Camp Metobrook. "They're still there," Mr. R reportedly said, "waiting in the trees. They look like men, but they're different inside. No souls, just hunger. They want what we have. They want to wear us like clothes." When Lawson asked what had happened to his companions at the hunting lodge, Mr. R became even more distressed. "They took them," he said. "Changed them, wore them, walked around in them. I could tell. The eyes were wrong. The way they moved was wrong. Like they were learning how to use the bodies. Lawson pressed for details, asking how Mr. R had escaped. "I didn't look at them," the old man whispered. "That's the secret. If you look directly at them, they know you can see them. And once they know that, they come for you." I kept my eyes down. I pretended I couldn't see them even when they stood right in front of me. And I prayed. I prayed until my throat was raw. I think they don't like that. The praying. It affects them somehow. Lawson initially dismissed these stories as the ravings of a mentally ill man. But as the situation in the camp deteriorated, he began to wonder. On January 18th, he wrote, "I can no longer deny that something is happening here beyond rational explanation. Last night, while making my rounds, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest just beyond the fence. It appeared to be a man, but something about its proportions was unusual, unusually tall, unusually thin. When I directed my flashlight toward it, it retreated into the trees, moving in a way that seemed unnatural. I've told no one. They would think I've succumbed to the same affliction affecting the prisoners." Lawson's entries became increasingly concerned as January progressed. He reported seeing the same figures multiple times, always at the edge of the forest, always at night. He began to experience the same insomnia that plagued the prisoners. On January 25th, he wrote, "I understand now why they fear mirrors. Today I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window of the infirmary. For a moment, just a moment, it didn't look quite right. The eyes seemed different, the mouth too wide. When I blinked, it was gone. Am I experiencing hallucinations, or is there something in this place that can alter perceptions?" A particularly troubling entry from January 27th describes an encounter with a prisoner who had been one of the first to exhibit severe symptoms. "I found Krause staring at the wall again today," Lawson wrote. "When I approached him, he turned to look at me, and I nearly stepped back. His eyes were unusual, not just vacant or dilated, but somehow different, as if I was looking into something unfamiliar. He smiled at me, a strange, stretched expression that seemed unnatural, and said, 'We see you, Doctor. We see all of you now.' His voice had a strange quality, like multiple voices speaking in unison, but slightly out of sync. I administered a sedative immediately. He is currently restrained in the infirmary, but I confess I am afraid to check on him. I fear what I might find looking back at me from Krause's face." The most chilling entry came on February 1st, the night before the power failure. Lawson wrote, "They're getting closer. Every night they come nearer to the buildings. The prisoners know. They've known from the beginning. These things, whatever they are, were here long before us. They live in the spaces between the trees. They're drawn to us, or perhaps we to them. I believe they feed on fear, on confusion, and now they've developed a taste for it. God help us if the lights go out. The power failed the very next night." Lawson's final entry, dated February 3rd, was nearly illegible, the handwriting erratic, and pressed deeply into the page. "I saw them. In the darkness. They came through the walls just as the prisoners said. Strange, different, wearing faces that weren't quite right, our faces, but wrong, moving in unusual ways. Some of the men ran. Others simply surrendered. I hid and watched as they surrounded the men, as they reached inside them somehow. Not physically. They reached into their minds, and then they wore them like suits that didn't quite fit. When the lights came back on, they were gone. But they'll be back when darkness falls. They always come back." Lawson's journal ended there. According to the Barrett report, Dr. Thomas Lawson was found in his quarters when the investigation team arrived, alive but unresponsive. He was removed from the camp along with the affected prisoners and committed to a psychiatric hospital in Maryland. Records indicate he never spoke another word. He passed away in 1958, still institutionalized. What little information exists about Lawson's final years comes from the notes of Dr. Howard Reed, the psychiatrist who treated him from 1945 until his passing. Reed described Lawson as profoundly changed, who spent his days sitting motionless, staring at walls. "The only time he shows any reaction," Reed wrote in 1952, "is when he catches sight of his own reflection. Then he becomes extremely agitated, often distressed, attempting to break any reflective surface. We have removed all mirrors and glass objects from his vicinity." Reed also noted a peculiar physical symptom that developed in Lawson's later years. His movements have become increasingly stiff and deliberate, he wrote in 1956. He walks with an unusual gait. When he does move his hands, it is with a strange deliberation, as if he is concentrating intently on each finger. It is reminiscent of someone relearning motor skills after a profound neurological event. The 9 prisoners who remained unaffected provided similar accounts when interviewed by Colonel Barrett's team. All reported sensing presences at the edge of the forest. All had experienced a sense of being watched. But unlike their comrades, they had found ways to resist. Several mentioned that they had been raised with strong religious beliefs and had prayed constantly. Others had developed protective routines. One man claimed he had discovered that the entities, whatever they were, seemed unable or unwilling to approach his bunk after he took certain precautions. Most significantly, all 9 survivors reported that they had realized early on never to look directly at the figures in the forest or acknowledge their presence in any way. As one prisoner told Barrett, they are like predators. If you show fear, if you run, they pursue. If you look at them, they know you can see them, and they come for you. The others made this mistake. They saw, they feared, they ran, and so they were affected. The transcripts of these interviews, included in Barrett's report, reveal a consistent description of the entities that allegedly haunted Camp Metobrook. The prisoners described them as humanoid, but unusual, too tall, too thin, with movements that seemed unnatural. Their faces were said to be indistinct at first, but over time they began to resemble the prisoners and guards. It was as if they were learning to copy us, one prisoner explained. Each night their imitations became more perfect. By the end, they could look exactly like someone you knew. The only way to tell was the eyes, always different, like looking into a deep well. When asked how the entities affected their victims, the survivors' accounts again showed remarkable consistency. They didn't describe physical attacks, but rather a kind of psychological influence. They would stand over a man's bed at night, one prisoner said, just watching, night after night, until the man began to change. It started with sleeplessness, then paranoia. Then the man would start to fade somehow, like his personality was being altered bit by bit. Eventually, there was nothing left but an empty body that moved and spoke, but wasn't the same anymore. Another survivor put it more directly. They influence the mind, the personality. They change you from the inside, then use what remains. After evacuating the camp, military authorities ordered it demolished. By April 1944, nothing remained of Camp Metobrook except concrete foundations. The area was designated a restricted military zone, ostensibly due to unexploded ordnance. It remained closed to the public until 1960, when it was quietly transferred to the National Forest Service and reintegrated into the Hiawatha National Forest. For decades, the true story of what happened at Camp Metobrook remained hidden in classified documents. Even after Richard Dennison discovered Lawson's journal in 1968, his attempts to bring the story to light were stymied. His superiors confiscated the journal, and Dennison was transferred to a different department. He persisted in his investigation privately, tracking down and interviewing 2 of the 9 survivors who were still alive and had returned to Germany after the war. According to Dennison's notes, both men still refused to speak openly about what they had experienced. One would only say, "Some places in this world are thin. The barriers between here and elsewhere are weak." Metobrook was such a place. The other was more direct. There are things in the dark places of the world that hunger for what makes us human. Our thoughts, our emotions, our awareness, they feed on these things, and once they have a taste, they never stop seeking. Dennison compiled his findings into a manuscript titled The Visitors of Metobrook, which he attempted to publish in 1969. No publisher would touch it. Dennison was involved in a vehicle accident in 1970, all his research reportedly destroyed in the subsequent fire. However, a partial copy of his manuscript was preserved by his sister, along with photocopies of some of the original documents, including several pages from Lawson's journal. The circumstances of Dennison's accident raised questions among those familiar with his research. The incident occurred on a straight stretch of highway on a clear day. No mechanical failures were identified in the vehicle. A witness reported seeing Dennison's car suddenly swerve off the road for no apparent reason. More disturbing were the statements of the first responders who arrived at the scene. According to the police report, Dennison was still alive when they reached him, though severely injured. His last words, as recorded by a paramedic, were, "They followed me. They found me. They look like people now." The fire that consumed Dennison's car, and subsequently his home, was attributed to a ruptured fuel line. However, fire investigators noted unusual burn patterns that were difficult to explain. The fire seemed to have multiple points of origin, and it burned at temperatures higher than typically expected in a car fire. Most of Dennison's research materials were destroyed, with only those few documents that were in his sister's possession surviving. Dennison's sister, Mary Carmichael, became concerned that her brother had been silenced because of what he had discovered about Camp Metobrook. In 1972, she attempted to continue his investigation, but was reportedly warned by anonymous phone calls to leave the past buried after her home was broken into and the remaining documents temporarily taken. They were returned several days later, apparently photocopied. She ceased her efforts. The materials remained in her possession until her passing in 1994, when they were donated to the University of Michigan's archives by her daughter. These materials remained in private hands until 1996, when they were donated to the University of Michigan's archives. They were cataloged but largely forgotten until 2005, when historian Dr. Eliza Chen discovered them while researching the treatment of POWs in the United States during World War II. Dr. Chen published an academic paper on the Camp Metobrook incident, carefully framing it as a case study in mass psychogenic illness and the psychological effects of prisoner of war confinement. Dr. Chen's paper, titled Isolation and Delusion, a case study of mass psychogenic illness in a Evacuation POW facility, was published in the Journal of Military History in 2006. It presented a rational, psychological explanation for the events at Camp Metobrook, attributing the prisoners' experiences to a combination of factors: the extreme isolation of the camp, the harsh winter conditions, the stress of captivity, and the power of suggestion in a closed environment. The paper was well received in academic circles and might have been the final word on the Metobrook incident, relegating it to a footnote in the history of military psychology. But Dr. Chen's research revealed one final disturbing epilogue to the Metobrook story. In 1983, the National Forest Service constructed a small ranger station approximately 2 miles from the former campsite. Between 1983 and 1988, the station reported an unusually high turnover rate. Rangers requested transfers after reporting sleep disturbances, feelings of being watched, and unusual shadow activity at the perimeter of the station after dark. In 1988, following the disappearance of a ranger who went on a routine patrol and never returned, the station was closed. The official reason given was budget cuts. Dr. Chen interviewed several former rangers who had been stationed at the Hiawatha Outpost, as it was called. Their accounts were strikingly similar to those of the Camp Metobrook prisoners 4 decades earlier. They described a persistent feeling of being observed from the surrounding forest. They reported hearing whispers or voices, especially at night. Several mentioned seeing tall, thin figures standing motionless among the trees at dusk, figures that would vanish when approached. The most detailed account came from former ranger Paul Simmons, who had served at the outpost from 1985 to 1987. There was something unusual about that place, he told Dr. Chen, something in the air, in the silence. You'd be sitting in the station at night, and suddenly you'd know, absolutely know, that something was standing right outside the window, looking in at you. But when you'd turn to look, there was nothing there. Or worse, you'd catch just a glimpse of something moving away into the trees. Simmons described an incident that occurred during his second winter at the outpost. We had a bad storm, power went out for about 6 hours. I was alone at the station that night. I had a fire going in the wood stove and plenty of candles, so it wasn't completely dark. But it was dark enough. Around 2 a.m. I heard what sounded like footsteps circling the building, slow, deliberate steps in the snow. I grabbed my flashlight and weapon and checked each window, but saw nothing. The footsteps continued. Then they stopped right outside the front door. There was a long silence, and then, I swear this happened, the doorknob started to turn, very slowly. I had locked it, thankfully. Whatever was out there tried the door for about a minute, then stopped. I heard the footsteps move away around the building again, and then silence. I sat up the rest of the night with my back to the wall, flashlight and gun ready. When dawn came, I went outside to check for tracks. There were none, not a single footprint in the fresh snow. Simmons requested a transfer shortly after this incident. His request was granted, and he finished his career with the Forest Service in Yellowstone National Park. When Dr. Chen asked if he thought the outpost was haunted, Simmons shook his head. "Not haunted," he said. "Haunted implies spirits of the departed. Whatever was out there in those woods wasn't that. It was something else entirely, just not familiar." The ranger who disappeared from the Hiawatha outpost in 1988 was James Holloway, a 32-year-old with 8 years of experience with the Forest Service. According to the official report, Holloway left the station on a routine patrol on November 12, 1988, and never returned. A search and rescue operation was initiated when he failed to check in that evening, but it was hampered by an early winter storm that dropped over a foot of snow on the area. Holloway's service vehicle was found abandoned on a forest road approximately 5 miles from the station. His backpack, containing his lunch and equipment, was still in the vehicle. There was no sign of struggle or accident. The search continued for 2 weeks before being officially suspended. Holloway was declared missing, presumed lost, possibly from exposure or animal encounter. His body was never recovered. However, a disturbing addendum to the case emerged in March 1989, when a hiker reported finding a Forest Service uniform jacket hanging from a tree near the abandoned Camp Metobrook site. The jacket was identified as Holloway's, but despite a renewed search of the area, no further traces of him were discovered. Following Holloway's disappearance and the discovery of his jacket, the Forest Service permanently closed the Hiawatha outpost. The building was dismantled in the summer of 1989, and the area was redesignated as wilderness, with no permanent structures permitted. Forest Service maps were redrawn to route hiking trails away from the vicinity of both the former outpost and the Camp Metobrook site. To this day, hikers in that section of the Hiawatha National Forest occasionally report unusual experiences, disorientation, lost time, and glimpses of tall, thin figures standing motionless among the trees. Local guides refuse to take groups into the area after 4 p.m., ensuring they're well away before darkness falls. Forest Service maps mark the region with warnings about rugged terrain and poor trail conditions, subtly discouraging visitors without explicitly acknowledging the area's history. The concrete foundations of Camp Metobrook still exist, though they're not marked on any public maps. Those who have found them describe an immediate and overwhelming sense of unease, a certainty that they are being watched from the surrounding forest. Many report that electronic devices malfunction in the vicinity. Cameras capture strange distortions or unusual shadows at the edge of the frame. Audio recordings pick up what sound like whispers in no recognizable language. In 2010, a group of paranormal investigators attempted to conduct an overnight study at the Metobrook site. Led by Stephen Morris, a self-described skeptical investigator with a background in psychology, the 5-member team set up equipment including night vision cameras, audio recorders, and various environmental sensors. According to Morris's report, published on his website before it was taken down in 2011, the investigation was abandoned after only 4 hours. "Something was moving just beyond the range of our cameras," Morris wrote. "We all perceived it, tall humanoid shapes that seemed to move between the trees. Our equipment began to malfunction almost immediately. Batteries drained despite being fully charged. Cameras captured only static. The temperature dropped precipitously around 11 p.m., falling nearly 20 degrees in a matter of minutes. far more than the natural nighttime cooling would explain. Morris described an increasing sense of unease that affected all team members. We began to experience intense feelings of concern and the unshakable sensation of being watched. 2 team members reported hearing whispers that seemed to come from all directions at once. At approximately 11:30 p.m., team member Laura Diaz began to exhibit extreme distress, claiming she could perceive figures standing in the darkness just beyond our camp. When we directed lights toward these areas, nothing was visible. Yet Diaz insisted they were still there, watching us. The breaking point came shortly after midnight. Team member Michael Reeves, who had been monitoring our perimeter, began calling out that they were coming through the trees. When we reached him, he was in a state of complete alarm, trying to leave the site. It took 3 of us to calm him. His eyes were dilated, and he kept repeating, "Don't look at them. If you see them, they see you." At this point, we made the decision to evacuate immediately. We gathered what equipment we could and quickly returned to our vehicles. In my 15 years of paranormal investigation, I have never experienced anything like what we encountered at Camp Metobrook. I cannot explain it in rational terms, and I will not be returning to that location under any circumstances. Morris's website, which had featured reports of dozens of paranormal investigations, was taken down entirely in early 2011. Attempts by interested parties to contact him have been unsuccessful. The other members of his team have similarly declined to discuss the Metobrook investigation. One former team member, contacted by email in 2012, responded only with, "Some things should not be investigated. Some places should be left alone. Please respect our privacy and do not contact us again regarding that night." What really happened at Camp Metobrook in that winter of 1943-44? Was it, as the military officially claimed, simply a case of mass psychosis brought on by the stress of captivity and the extreme isolation of the northern Michigan winter? Or was there something in those woods, something that had been there long before the camp was built, something that the native peoples had recognized and avoided centuries earlier? The 9 men who emerged from Camp Metobrook with their minds intact took that knowledge to their final rest. The last survivor, Carl Müller, passed away in Hamburg in 1994. According to his family, he slept with the lights on until the day he died. He never kept mirrors in his home, and he left instructions that after his passing, his body was to be cremated, not buried. "The earth is not safe," his final letter explained. "They can reach you even there." Perhaps the most compelling evidence that something truly inexplicable occurred at Camp Metobrook comes from the scattered testimonies of those who encountered the 18 prisoners who experienced profound psychological changes there. These men, distributed to various mental institutions across the United States after the war, exhibited remarkably similar behaviors despite being housed in facilities thousands of miles apart, with no contact with each other. Medical records obtained through FOIA requests, though heavily redacted, show consistent patterns. All 18 men displayed extreme sensitivity to light, preferring to sit in darkness whenever possible. All exhibited what psychiatrists termed mirror avoidance response, becoming distressed when confronted with their own reflections. And all demonstrated the same peculiar physical mannerisms: stiff, deliberate movements, especially of the hands and fingers, as if they were unfamiliar with the operation of their own bodies. Dr. Margaret Wilson, who worked as a psychiatric nurse at Bellevue Hospital in New York from 1952 to 1965, encountered one of these patients during her tenure. In an interview conducted in 1975, she described her impressions of the man identified only as Patient G. There was something profoundly unusual about him, Dr. Wilson recalled. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice had an odd quality, flat, monotonous, with peculiar pauses between words, as if he was translating from another language in his head before speaking. But it was his eyes that disturbed me most. They were different somehow. Looking into them was like looking into a deep well where the bottom couldn't be seen. Dr. Wilson described an incident that occurred during a thunderstorm when the hospital briefly lost power. Most patients become anxious during blackouts, but patient G had a different reaction. For the first time since I'd known him, he became animated. He stood up and began moving toward the door with a strange, eager expression. One of the orderlies blocked his path, and patient G changed. There's no other way to describe it. His face formed an expression I've never seen on a human being before or since. A kind of intense anticipation that seemed deeply unfamiliar. He spoke a single sentence, in perfect English, with none of his usual hesitation. "The darkness sets us free." Then the emergency generators kicked in. The lights came back on, and he immediately reverted to his usual distant state, as if nothing had happened. For those interested in seeing the site for themselves, a word of caution. The forest has reclaimed most of the area where Camp Metobrook once stood. The concrete foundations are crumbling and dangerous, and according to local forestry officials, several hikers who have sought out the location in recent years have required rescue after becoming inexplicably disoriented, even in broad daylight. All reported the same unsettling experience, the certainty that something was following them just out of sight, between the trees. Perhaps most concerning of all is what happened to the team from the University of Michigan that attempted to conduct an archaeological survey of the site in 1998. Led by Dr. Marcus Hamilton, the four-person team set up camp near the foundations with the intention of mapping the remains and collecting artifacts for analysis. On the second night, a storm knocked out their generator. In the darkness, Dr. Hamilton reported hearing movement around the tents. By morning, one team member was missing. He was found 3 days later, wandering along a road 20 miles away, with no memory of how he had gotten there. The missing team member, graduate student David Chen, was hospitalized for severe dehydration and exposure. When he recovered physically, he was diagnosed with acute stress disorder, which later developed into PTSD. He dropped out of the university's archaeology program shortly thereafter. In 2008, he agreed to a single interview with a journalist researching the Metobrook incident on condition of anonymity. That interview, never published but later leaked online, offers a disturbing glimpse into what the team might have encountered. "I remember fragments," Chen said, "waking up in my tent to a sound like whispering right outside the canvas, opening my eyes to see something silhouetted against the tent wall. A figure, but unusual somehow. Too tall, too thin, standing perfectly still. I think I must have lost consciousness from fear. The next thing I remember is walking through the forest in the dark. But I wasn't alone. They were walking with me, around me. I could sense them more than see them. Every time I tried to look directly at one, it would be gone, but I could still feel them there, just at the edge of my vision. They were leading me somewhere, or guiding me. I don't know how long this went on. Time seemed to stretch and contract. When asked how he had ended up on the road where he was found, Chen's response was unsettling. I think they lost interest in me. Or maybe they realized I wasn't what they were looking for. I remember standing in a clearing. The trees formed a perfect circle around it. They were there, just beyond the tree line, watching me. I could feel their attention. One of them, the tallest, stepped forward, almost into the clearing. For a second I could see it clearly. It looked like me. My face, but not quite right. It reached out a hand, unusually long, and touched my forehead. And then, nothing. Until I woke up on the side of the road with a rescue team standing over me. The university abandoned the survey. Dr. Hamilton resigned his position shortly thereafter and reportedly left academia entirely. When contacted by researchers in 2005, he refused to discuss the Metobrook site, saying only, "Some places should be left alone. Some histories should remain buried. What waits in those woods is better left undisturbed." The U.S. government has never officially acknowledged the events at Camp Metobrook. If OIA requests for information about the camp are routinely denied, citing national security concerns, an unusual response for documents relating to a long-abandoned POW facility from World War II. What remains of the story exists only in fragments. Photocopied pages of Lawson's journal, portions of Denison's manuscript, and the testimonies of the few who have encountered whatever still dwells in that section of the Hiawatha National Forest. In 2015, a Freedom of Information Act request filed by journalist Robert Morrow sought all documents related to Camp Metobrook held by the Department of Defense, the Department of the Army, and the National Archives. After 2 years of appeals and legal pressure, Morrow received a packet of heavily redacted documents, most of which contained only basic information about the camp's construction and operational costs. However, included in these materials was a curious memorandum dated March 1944 from the Office of the Secretary of War to the Commanding General of the 6th Service Command, which had jurisdiction over military installations in Michigan. The memorandum, mostly redacted, included this revealing paragraph. Regarding the incident at Camp Redacted, it is the determination of this office that all records pertaining to the psychological affliction observed among prisoners be classified as top secret under provisions of Executive Order 91082. No mention of these events is to be made in any public record or communication. Personnel involved are to be dispersed to separate commands and instructed not to discuss their experiences under penalty of court-martial. The site is to be abandoned and all structures removed. The official explanation for the camp's closure will cite unsuitability of terrain and extreme weather conditions. Morrow's subsequent requests for clarification or additional documents were denied. In his article published in the Detroit Free Press in 2018, Morrow wrote, "The government's continued classification of documents related to a POW camp that operated for less than 3 months over 70 years ago raises troubling questions. What happened at Camp Metobrook that warrants such secrecy even today? What are they still concealing and why?" As for the 18 prisoners who experienced profound psychological changes at Camp Metobrook, records of their fate after the war are incomplete. Most apparently remained institutionalized in various facilities across the United States. Their status as former enemy combatants largely forgotten as they became simply patients with mysterious and untreatable conditions. According to what few medical records have surfaced, they exhibited remarkably similar symptoms throughout the remainder of their lives, periods of catatonia alternating with extreme agitation, an inability to look at their own reflections, and a consistent unease in darkness. Perhaps most telling is what one former nurse reported about her experience working with these patients at a facility in Pennsylvania in the 1950s. They would sometimes speak lucidly, she recalled, in an interview conducted in 1968, but they would never speak about themselves in the first person. They always said he or this one when referring to themselves, as if they were talking about someone else. And sometimes, when they thought no one was watching, I'd catch them studying their hands, flexing their fingers slowly, as if they were trying to figure out how they worked. Another healthcare worker, an orderly at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., where 2 of the affected prisoners were housed from 1946 to 1954, reported similar observations. "They moved differently," he said in a statement recorded in 1971. "That's the only way I can describe it. Like they were wearing clothes that didn't fit, and their eyes. Their eyes were always unusual, different. I worked the night shift, and sometimes I'd find them standing by the windows, perfectly still, staring out into the darkness. One night, I asked one of them what he was looking at. He turned to me very slowly, mechanically, and said, 'They are coming closer. Soon there will be enough of us.' I requested a transfer to the day shift after that." The last known survivor from this group, Dieter Hoffmann, passed away in 1976 at a state hospital in New York. According to the attending physician's notes, his final words were, "They never left. They came back with us. They're wearing us now, walking among you, and no one can tell the difference." Dr. James Peterson, the physician who recorded Hoffmann's last statement, included a personal note in the medical file. "In 30 years of psychiatric practice, I have never been as affected by a patient's words as I was by Hoffmann's final utterance. The clarity and conviction with which he spoke after decades of near catatonia was itself remarkable, but it was the change in his eyes that stays with me still. For a brief moment, as he spoke those words, his typically vacant gaze was replaced by an intense focus and awareness that I had never observed in him before. It was as if, after all those years, someone else was looking out through Hoffman's eyes. Someone who had been watching and waiting for a very long time. Is there any truth to the story of Camp Metobrook? The official position of both the U.S. military and the Forest Service is that the camp was simply closed due to harsh conditions, and any legends that have grown up around it are just that, legends. The foundations that remain in the forest are dismissed as the remnants of old logging operations or Depression-era CCC projects. But those who have studied the fragmentary evidence, Lawson's journal, Barrett's report, Dennison's manuscript, and the testimonies of witnesses over the decades, tell a different story. They speak of a place where something unusual and unknown broke through into our world, a place where the boundaries between realities thinned, a place where entities that should not exist found a way to reach into the minds of men and alter them from within. And they suggest that whatever happened at Camp Metobrook in that winter of 1943 may not have ended with the camp's destruction. The 9 survivors escaped with their sanity intact, but carried the knowledge of what they had experienced with them. The 18 who lost their minds may have lost something else as well, something essential that defined them as human. And in their place, something else may have returned to the world wearing their faces, learning to mimic humanity while remaining fundamentally different inside. In 2013, neurologist Dr. Sarah Jenkins published a paper in the Journal of Psychiatric Research examining the medical records of the Camp Metobrook patients. She proposed a scientific explanation for their condition, suggesting they had suffered from a rare form of shared psychosis complicated by severe PTSD and possibly exacerbated by environmental factors such as extreme isolation and sensory deprivation. Her paper was well received in the scientific community, offering a rational framework for understanding what had previously been relegated to the realm of legend and supernatural speculation. However, in a strange postscript to this story, Dr. Jenkins withdrew from public life shortly after her paper was published. She canceled scheduled speaking engagements and took an indefinite leave of absence from her position at Johns Hopkins University. Colleagues reported that in the weeks before her disappearance from academic circles, she had become increasingly concerned, claiming she was being followed and observed. Her current whereabouts are unknown. A former research assistant who worked with Dr. Jenkins on the Metobrook paper spoke anonymously to a reporter in 2015, saying, "Something happened during that research that changed her. She was always so rational, so grounded in science. But after weeks of studying those case files, reading the testimonies, looking at the few photographs that exist of those patients, she started to change. She became preoccupied with mirrors, covering the one in her office with a cloth. She told me once, 'What if they're still out there? What if knowing about them, thinking about them, attracts their attention?' The last time I saw her, she said something that still concerns me. 'I think they know I've been looking for them. And now they're looking back.' Next time you meet someone whose smile doesn't quite reach their eyes, who moves as if they're still learning how their limbs work, who seems to be watching you with an intensity that makes you deeply uncomfortable, remember the story of Camp Metobrook. Remember the visitors who came from between the trees, and consider, just for a moment, if they might still be walking among us, wearing faces that don't belong to them, watching and waiting for the barriers to thin once more. For some who hear this story, it will remain just that, a story, a tale of mass psychosis, wartime stress, and the power of suggestion. But for those who have felt the weight of unseen eyes while walking in deep forests, who have glimpsed movement at the corner of their vision that shouldn't be there, who have awakened in the night with the certainty that something is standing in the darkest corner of their room, for those people, the story of Camp Metobrook resonates with a deeper truth. The Hiawatha National Forest still stands. The place once known as Camp Metobrook still exists, unmarked and overgrown. And if local stories are to be believed, the visitors still walk between the trees when darkness falls. still reach out to those who acknowledge their presence, still seek what makes us human. A final, disturbing coda to this story emerged in 2018, when a digital archivist at the University of Michigan discovered a previously unnoticed audio recording among the Denison materials. The recording, on a badly deteriorated magnetic tape that required specialized restoration, contained a partial interview conducted by Denison in 1969 with a man identified only as former Guard B. The guard, whose voice was disguised, claimed to have been stationed at Camp Metobrook from December 1943 until its evacuation in February 1944. Much of the recording was too degraded to recover, but several segments were clear enough to transcribe. In one particularly chilling passage, the guard described an encounter that occurred in late January 1944. I was on perimeter patrol, northern fence line. It was around 0300 hours, cold as anything. Moon was bright on the snow. I saw a prisoner standing by the inner fence, looking out into the forest. It was Schneider. I recognized him. He shouldn't have been outside the barracks at that hour, so I started toward him to order him back inside. That's when I noticed he wasn't alone. There was something on the other side of the fence just at the edge of the tree line. Tall, thin. At first I thought it was just a shadow or a trick of the moonlight. But then it moved. It stepped forward right up to the fence, directly across from Schneider. And I swear it looked exactly like him. Same face, same uniform, like a perfect reflection, except for the eyes. Its eyes were just different. They stood there, facing each other across the fence. Then the thing on the outside raised its hand, and Schneider did the same, like they were reaching for each other through the wire. I should have called out, should have raised the alarm, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was frozen. Then the thing, it somehow passed its hand through the fence, through the solid wire, like it wasn't even there. And it touched Schneider's face, just for a second. Then it withdrew back into the forest, disappearing between the trees. Schneider stood there for another minute, then turned and walked back to the barracks. I finally got my wits about me and radioed in what I'd seen. The duty officer told me to report to the infirmary for evaluation. Said I was suffering from fatigue and cold exposure. But I know what I saw. And the next day, Schneider was different. Moving strangely, speaking strangely, looking at everyone like he'd never seen another human being before. 2 days later, he was found deceased in the washroom. The guard's account corroborates details found in Lawson's journal and the testimonies of the 9 surviving prisoners. When Denison asked what he thought the entities in the forest wanted, the guard's response was simple and unsettling. To wear us, to be us, to take what makes us human and use it for themselves. And the concerning part? I think some of them got out, got away when the camp was evacuated, walking around in bodies that used to belong to real people. Perfect disguises, and who would ever know the difference? So if you ever find yourself in northern Michigan, near the shores of Lake Superior, where the Hiawatha forest grows dense and old, pay attention to the warnings of local guides. Stay on marked trails. Return to civilization before sunset. And whatever you do, no matter what you might glimpse moving between the distant trees, do not look directly at it. Do not acknowledge its presence, because once they know you can see them, they never stop watching. And eventually, inevitably, they come for you.